Greetings everyone and welcome to a guided video tutorial where I'll be teaching you about the Slav defense. This is one of the most popular openings in chess. Today it's considered to be, I think, #1 option to be stopping d4 openings. And we're going to be looking at this mainly from the white's point of view. I will do my best to be explaining the very first moves so that beginner and intermediate level players will know why the moves are made. This is going to be a video less about memorization of the variations and more about understanding the ideas behind the moves. We're going to be covering the plans, the red flags on what to avoid, and I'm sure that after this video you'll be feeling very comfortable to go out there and try this online. So the opening starts after white plays d4. Black goes d5 to be stopping white from playing the pawn move to e4. And after white plays c4, it's very important to understand at this moment that white has a positional threat of removing the pawn on d5. And subsequently, after the black's queen is taking, we can play knight c3 followed by e4. This is not executed by a lot of players who, after, say, black plays knight to f6, are still playing a normal developing move like knight c3, say, and not punishing black in the way they should, with c takes d5, knight d5, and e4 covering the central squares and ending up with big advantage out of the opening. So just wanted to throw it out there. I think this is very important to understand positional threats as well as tactical threats along the opening lines. So our opponent is going to be playing c6, and that's a starting position of the Slav defense. The idea is simple. If we're going to be taking on d5, they can take this back with the pawn and still prevent us from playing the pawn move to e4. White has mainly two moves here, knight to c3 or knight f3, although c takes d5 can also be tried. Now, my recommendation is to play knight to c3. It's going to be a little bit more tricky for our opponents later to be developing the light square bishop out. So the main difference is that if we play knight to f3 right now, and for example, black plays knight to f6, and we're going to be playing a move like e3, black can, say, develop the bishop to f5 without too many problems, or the lines are easier for black here than after knight to c3, in my personal opinion. So instead of playing knight to f3, we're going to be playing knight to c3, and I will explain you why in a moment. Most of your opponents are going to be playing here the move knight to f6. So the idea is to cover this e4 square a couple more times. And then if black is going to be taking the pawn on c4, it's going to be much harder for white to comfortably achieve the pawn move to e4. As very often when black is going to be taking the pawn on c4, this knight on c3 is going to be susceptible to the attack by the pawns. That is, say, the quote-unquote the drawback or disadvantage of playing the knight to c3. And we're going to get to advantage in a moment. So if our opponent is going to be taking on c4 here right away, it's important not to play the move a4 immediately. That can be punished with pawn move to e5. Black is striking back in the center. By the way, many players can go wrong here because a4 is just a very typical idea in the Slav defense after they take the pawn on c4. So the idea is to, of course, disturb the white's development, and white is not going to get an advantage over here. So instead, we're going to be playing the move pawn to e4 here. This way we're taking over the middle as well as attacking the pawn on c4. So now our opponents are going to be playing the pawn move to b5. This time we can play the pawn move to a4, and right now we're applying pressure on the b5 pawn. So black is going to be pushing here, and we're going to drop the knight back to a2. Both pawns are under attack, and so you for sure are going to win the pawn back and get a comfortable middle game. So the lines could follow like knight f6. We're going to be playing pawn to e5 because the pawn is under attack. And here I'm going to give you a developing plan for white. I want you to play knight to f3. I want you to play castles. I would like you to play the bishop on d2 and apply pressure on b4. And if you have questions about this knight, it will comfortably go to the c1 square and then b3 square. And from there, you're going to be aiming at this weak square c5, where the knight is going to be very functional. So you have no problems here. If we're covering all the variations, video is going to be a couple of hours long. So I'm going to leave you here comfortably. I don't think you will have any issues. So as we're going back, I wanted to cover this sideline. If black is taking the pawn on c4, most of the time you're going to be seeing the move knight to f6. And in this position, my recommended move is e3, temporarily closing the dark square bishop. But later, when we're going to develop pieces, we're going to be playing pawn to e4, and our dark square bishop will be able to go out to say e3, f4, g5, where it's going to be most comfortable in that particular situation. The alternative is to play knight to f3, and I think that grandmasters would play e3 and knight f3 50-50. One move is not better than the other. It depends on the style, and my recommended move is e3 today in this video. So with this move, we finally protect the pawn on c4. Now, in this position, I will be revealing why I would like you to play the move knight to c3. I think it's more practical. We already saw some drawbacks or the lines that we need to know extra with the knight to c3. Mainly, if they took the pawn, the knight of ours can be under attack. But as I showed you, we're not having many issues over there if we know what we're doing. So over here, most of your opponents will want to play bishop to f5. The move in general, objectively, if you're playing this with the engine, has no problems. But in a practical sense, they're going to get likely in trouble. So what we're going to play is we're going to play c takes d5, c takes d5 to keep the central control, as of course knight takes d5 leaves white with more pawns in the center. And we're going to be playing the move queen to b3. So this knight on c3 is helping us to apply pressure on d5, and our queen is also hitting b7 now. Now I can reveal that at the highest level, the bishop can draw back to c8, and this is a playable position for black. It's funny, the argument is that while the bishop moved back, the queen on b3 is misplaced if the bishop is on c8, as the only thing that queen really does here is attacking that pawn on b3. So later, even though black wasted the tempo, white will have to give that tempo back by moving the queen back to where it's more active or functional, say to square like c2 or d1. Quite deep. White still ends up with slight advantage, but let's just say this is playable for black. I don't believe anyone who is beginner intermediate level player is going to see this. There's also knight to c6, an interesting gambit that black plays. White ends up a pawn up position, but black has some compensation. You're not going to see this most likely. So the moves that you're going to be seeing are the following. It's possible to see queen to b6, after which you're going to be ending up winning a pawn. So here we can play knight takes d5, and if black takes your queen, you have this in-between move of knight takes f6 check. And after they take on f6, you're ending up in the position pawn up. Let's look at alternatives. It's also possible to see queen d7 guarding the pawn like that. We're going to be playing knight to f3, say they play knight c6, and now knight to e5. Here we're hitting the knight and the queen. You're already developing the initiative, and they're unable to take the knight on e5 because over here you have this threat of threatening the knight and also going bishop b5, winning the black's queen. So it seems like they have to play a move like queen to c7 to keep an eye on b7. But then there is knight takes d5. So there are these ways of how white can be developing the initiative if black doesn't play those accurate moves. Another move that you could see over here after the move queen b3 is if they play pawn to b6. Here, like simply bishop b5 check, and next the pawn on d5 simply drops. So I think this knight to c3 is setting up a trap if black plays these moves bishop f5. So I want to show you this line again. If they play bishop to f5, we can play cd, cd, and queen b3 is a nice practical shot that can give you those opportunities in a practical game. Instead, most likely you're going to see e6 if you're playing at intermediate to advanced level. We're going to be playing knight to f3. Most of your opponents are going to be playing knight to d7. It's important to say that black should, if he takes on c4, only after the white slide square bishop has moved. So if they, for example, were to take on c4 here, you could see that we end up in this position with the black's knight still on b8. But if we're playing a move like knight d7 first for black, and then we play bishop to e2, now they end up in exactly the same position with the knight already developed to d7. So they want to wait for your bishop to go out if they take. Again, black doesn't have to take, but if they take, they wait for the light square bishop to come out. So in this position, there is a choice for you. I was deciding which variation to cover because I'm playing here queen to c2 and bishop d3 and b3. Today I'm going to be going for a very forcing line, bishop to d3. I think it's also most natural. We're developing the bishop, and we're ready to castle, and soon we hope to strike with pawn to e4. At this moment, typically black takes on c4 and plays the move b5. Here we're going to be going for the active square d3. We're going to be looking at the black's king, as well as supporting this pawn move to e4, as well as supporting knight to e4 in case black plays this move pawn to b4. So here we have this always square for the knight on e4. By the way, just so that you would note, if at some point the pawn is already on e4 and you cannot go with the knight there, it's also fine to go knight a4. Knight on the rim is not dim when you're looking at weak squares. So the c5 square has been weakened. It's a very important critical square for you to cover. Black wants to achieve this move in order to later open up their light square bishop. And so your knight is very decently placed over here, likely going to be exchanged when they're going to be playing pawn to c5. White is fine. Now, most of the time, what black wants to achieve, as I've mentioned over here, is pawn to a6 and pawn to c5 in order to open up this light square bishop of theirs, which currently looks very bad. As well, this c5 will help them equalize in space. They will have equal amount of pawns that fight for room on the board and in the center. White castles, black plays a6. Now they're ready to play c5. White strikes first with e4, and black goes c5. So quite a sharp line, which is known for these bishop d3 variations early on. Here, for white, we're going to be playing the pawn move to d5. You might be questioning, isn't that attack 3 times? Well, you see, it's very natural for us to be sacrificing a pawn here because black is lagging with castling. So opening up the center will be very dangerous for them. Like, let's say they take on d5 and we have these exchanges. We have rook to e1. This file is very dangerous for black. We have bishop g5, further application on the pinned piece. At any moment, we can play bishop takes b5, winning the pawn back as their own bishop is hanging. So it's very dangerous for black to be doing that, and I think you're going to be very comfortable if you ever get to this. So let's go back, and let's go to this point where we play d5. Typically, black first plays c4. They attack the bishop on d3, and this way they gain this c5 square that they could later use typically for the knight, but perhaps in some rare cases the queen and bishop could use that as well. We have bishop to c2, and now they play queen to c7. Remember, they do not want to take and open up the e file because their king will be getting in danger. So here we're going to be taking and creating this isolated pawn in the black's position that we immediately attack with knight to d4. Now they're playing knight to c5 in order to cover that square, and you can simply play the move bishop to e3 and finish the minor piece development. If you're a very advanced player, or if you're a master, you would perhaps want to know 15 more moves from here. I'm going to leave you here with very active position. You could see that you have all the minor pieces developed. Black's king safety is quite questionable, have strong space with e4. The position on the queen side can sometimes be broken with moves like a4. White at times include moves like f4. Queen e2 is a very typical move as well to prepare the rook moves to the center, like covering the d file. So very sharp, very active position, and I hope that you will find fun in playing these sharp lines in the Slav defense opening. Please let me know in the comments what opening should I be covering next. If you enjoyed the lesson, consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next class.